Welcome everybody to our final seminar for the semester. Just a quick note, we are recording, and as usual, this talk will be posted up on our YouTube channel. So if you're listening at home in the future or currently zooming in with us, welcome one and all. So before we start, I would of course like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded land of the Pamalung clan of the Awabakal people and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So we are ending on a high note today with an alumna and esteemed colleague, Dr. Jude Conway. So Jude is the daughter of a BHP metallurgist and was a programmer in the BHP Computer Center from 1979 to 1982, and a research officer at the National TAFE team, assessing the experiences of female apprentices in non-traditional trades in the Hunter region in the mid-'80s. In 2022, her PhD dissertation examined the women's movement in Newcastle in 1970s and 1980s, and the intersection of these pathways led her to the research that is for this talk. And this talk is based on a Labor History Journal article that she co-wrote with Associate Professor Nancy Cushing and Honorary Associate Professor Josephine May. So without any further ado, I'll pass it off to Jude, who will be talking to us today about the obstacle course, women's entry into skilled positions in the Newcastle steel industry from the 1980s to 1990s. I'll just share the screen and pass it off to Jude. Just a moment, sorry, while we make this actually visible and manageable. All right, so just click through as you're ready.
I'd also like to acknowledge that this is the unceded land of the Pamalung clan of the wonderful people, and pay my respects to all Indigenous First Nations people in Australia. Okay, now, strong trade unions in Australia contributed to our high standard of living. However, economist Barbara Pocock argues that the union's collusive practices with employers and the arbitration system made Australia's labour market one of the most gender segregated in the industrialised world in the 20th century. In the city of Newcastle, New South Wales, where the steel industry was the largest employer, the workplace separation of men and women was even more pronounced. In this talk, I argue that while the women's movement from the late 1960s began protesting about gender discrimination and lobbied for anti-discrimination acts, it was the infamous Star Hotel riot in 1979 that brought about effective efforts to assist young women to enter male-dominated occupations in Newcastle. I will outline the obstacles and successes of those women who disrupted the male ownership of steel industry jobs and the social constructs of masculinity and femininity. Let's begin. Protective legislation in 19th century Britain, and consequently Australia, designed to retain women's health for childbearing, excluded them from underground mining and restricted the hours they could work and the weights they could lift in manufacturing. Historian Beverly Kingston assessed that the long-term effect was to remove women from the mainstream of industrial development. Also, with female wages only 54% of the male rate, trade unions acted to keep better paid industrial employment as the domain of men, because of their fear that employers would favour cheaper women workers. When the BHP Steelworks opened in Newcastle in 1915, a mainly male workforce was recruited. 2 young women were hired for clerical duties, but the general manager told the pair that whether the company would employ more women depended on their ability and success, establishing a long-lasting dynamic in which individual women had the responsibility of representing their entire sex. The 2 performed well, and the following year BHP employed its first female draftsman. Over the decades, small numbers of women were employed in administration, laboratory, cleaning and food services, while men in their thousands worked everywhere at the BHP and its associated steel companies in Newcastle. In the main, women were not employed to work on the plant. The plant was where the furnaces and mills blended and fired raw materials to produce iron and steel. The plant was considered a virile space where hard work needed strong muscles. The cultural constructs of femininity, which dictated that women should be attractive, dainty and clean, made it difficult for men to accept the idea of women on the plant and for women to imagine themselves there. Despite these beliefs, segregation was not always maintained. Faced with shortages of male labour as men enlisted in the armed forces in World War II, from late 1941, the Australian government recruited women into essential industries. In Newcastle, about 2,000 women were employed in the steel industry, mainly in tool rooms or munitions annexes, working on lathes, manufacturing shells, and ensuring tools and gun parts were precise. A small number were trained to operate cranes and to weld. Most of them had to hand their jobs back to returning servicemen once the war ended. After the war, sex-segregated workplaces remained de jure. Although there was a surplus of women seeking jobs in Newcastle, BHP preferred to recruit men from Europe, in particular from what was then Yugoslavia. However, in 1973, as a result of stagflation caused by the OPEC oil crisis, the federal government directed BHP to temporarily halt overseas recruitment. Concerned about filling orders, BHP hired 200 women to work in the special steel section and the merchant mill. The Secretary of the Newcastle Federated Ironworkers Association, the FIA, expressed concern that women would give away their femininity working on the plant. Joy Cummings, at the time the sole female alderman on Newcastle City Council, retorted that women could lose more than that if they don't get work, and congratulated BHP on their hiring. The Newcastle FAI president stated the usual arguments that steelmaking was too hot, too strenuous and too tiring for women, and that the FIA would oppose any moves to have them in the blast furnace. Cummings replied, BHP is not likely to employ women in the coke ovens or the blast furnace. And a local journalist concluded, of all the bastions of male supremacy, none could be safer than the blast furnaces of the BHP. After lobbying by the women's movement, an Anti-Discrimination Act was ushered in by the New South Wales Labor government in 1977, making it unlawful to discriminate in employment on the grounds of sex, race, and marital status. BHP's tentative steps in employing women in coming years were designed to fend off possible charges of discrimination. Although I have anecdotal evidence that 3 females started electrical apprenticeships at BHP in 1977, in January 1980, the employment of 4 female apprentices in the BHP mechanical and electrical shops was heralded as historic for Newcastle feminists and for Newcastle steelwork. Those 4 joined just over 400 women amongst the 10,800 BHP employees. I was one of those 400 based in the air-conditioned computer centre. Only 140 women, a drop from the 200 in 1973, worked on the plant where the 4 female apprentices would be based alongside 857 male apprentices. Just like the secretaries in 1915, these women were regarded as an experiment, placing them under intense pressure. A tiny number of women also began to be brought in as trainees. In 1979, there had been only 8 women students, 1.3% in the engineering faculty at the University of Newcastle. One of those, Janet Murray, was offered a chemical engineering traineeship with BHP in 1980 after having been rejected the year before. And she became one of 3 female trainees at BHP that year who worked part-time alongside studying. Now, also significantly, in 1980, a community task force for youth employment was set up by Joy Cummings, then the Lord Mayor of Newcastle, as a response to a riot in September 1979 at the Star Hotel. A large crowd of young people had protested the abrupt closure of the popular pub by clashing violently with police, leading to dramatic images beamed around the globe of police vans on fire and police and young people injured. New South Wales Premier Neville Wran expressed his disgust with the rioters. Initial responses blamed excessive alcohol, but Cummings felt that high youth unemployment was the underlying cause. Her community task force did a survey of unemployment and found that while there was significant unemployment amongst young men, young women in Newcastle experienced double that rate with even higher levels of education. This was already known, but in the climate of the women's movement, the task force launched a Girls in Trades campaign in June 1980 to convince local employers that it was good economic sense to make use of the virtually untapped reservoir of young women. BHP took notice and included more female apprentices in their mid-year intake. The task force also perceived a need for public role models and produced radio and television ads with women portrayed as electricians, mechanics, welders and carpenters. And they distributed stickers like this one. Back in 1978, the Wran government had launched a statewide campaign to get girls into non-traditional apprenticeships, very low-key. It had posters like in buses and trains. But because of concern about the Star Hotel riot, the government established a 2-year equal opportunity program specifically for the hunter. One program employee, Barbara Pocock, now a Green Senator, by the way, was tasked with persuading employers to broaden diversity in the workforce and to identify positions which could be filled by women and minority groups. The other employee, Kathy Sharp, was to initiate and coordinate programs at TAFE. Journalist, National Times journalist at the time, Adele Horan, assessed that it took the Star Hotel riot to draw attention to the plight of Newcastle women and girls and for the government to act. The program organised an equal opportunity seminar in early 1982, and all the speakers, with one exception, supported women's entry into non-traditional employment. The exception was a building contractor who was adamant that women had no place in building, construction and civil engineering, based on his experience of one woman in the industry who suffered vertigo. Believing that girls' education should make them first-class mothers, wives and partners, he articulated the view of many Newcastle employers that segregated spheres for men and women should be maintained. But naysayers could not stop the momentum. The various campaigns resulted in the Hunter region leading Australia in the number of young women apprenticed by both government and private employers. At the start of 1980, there had been fewer than a dozen enrolled in what TAFE categorised as non-traditional trades, which included commercial cookery at the time. By 1982, there were 152 females enrolled in those trades at Newcastle TAFE, with another 51 at Hunter region colleges. At the professional level, women students had risen to 6.2% of the university's faculty of engineering. Women were on the move into non-traditional occupations. Now, these pioneers faced many challenges, and because there was great interest in how they were faring, 3 key surveys were carried out. A student from the Newcastle College of Advanced Education interviewed 30 female apprentices in fitting and machining, electrical, sign writing, electronics, and wood machining. Another student from the university interviewed male and female apprentices in fitting and machining, which of course were mainly in the steel industry. And the third, the largest, and the one I worked on, which ended up with 120 respondents, was the National TAFE Survey of female apprentices in the Hunter region, including some of those who had withdrawn. These surveys, along with newspaper articles and later interviews, flesh out the obstacles the women faced when breaking into masculine domains. Importantly, they showed that women on the whole found industrial work interesting and did not to any significant extent experience the difficulties predicted by employers and unionists in justifying their exclusion. One common claim had been that the work would be too dirty for women. Although questions were asked about this, no evidence emerged that the women could not cope with the black dust that covered the plant. Industrial work had been said to be too heavy for women, and although some tasks did pose as challenges in their first 2 years, the women managed by using levers or hoists or asking for help. But by their 3rd year, they had learnt useful techniques and built up their strength. One apprentice realised how much stronger she was when she beat a male friend at arm wrestling. A former secretary with a traineeship as a structural engineer, starting in the BHP boilermaking section, found the work was not as heavy as people made it out to be. Her view was corroborated by a male boilermaker who, after observing 2 women at work, was convinced that there was no natural reason why a female could not be a boilermaker. Now, there's no denying that women could be physically challenged at times. A BHP billet mill roller, who was a chemical engineer trainee, described how she had to ask one of her crew for help when she jammed the screws on a mill stand. It was such an awful job. She baked him a cake to say thank you. While this incident substantiated one argument that women could take up men's time, it also showed how women brought their own talents to the job. Now, after training as a metallurgist, Denise Goldsworthy became the first ever female shift foreman in the BHP steelmaking mill, in an industry which operated 24 hours a day, so there were 3 shifts. Her all-male crew put all new starters through the trial of shovelling coal through the door of a 1700-degree furnace. Goldsworthy judged it necessary to show the men that she wasn't going to get the blokes to do the hard work, that she had to have a go. It took her only 6 weeks to master the task, and the day she shoveled the coal squarely through the furnace door, her crew said she didn't have to do it anymore. They adopted a fatherly role, declaring they would look after her. It was the men who could not accept women as equals or imagine them as part of a family structure who caused problems, ranging from microaggressions to threats of sexual violence. The challenges to women's safety were magnified in contrast to World War II because the trainees, the apprentices were as young as 15, were not part of a large intake of women who worked in groups. Isolation was a key factor for many of those who withdrew. Their angst is captured in the words of one apprentice. I might have stayed on if I hadn't been the first girl they'd ever taken on. I was the experiment, wasn't I? The men let me know I was the only girl all the time. Now, ridicule is a popular style of humour with male industrial workers. For the women, however, it was confronting to be the butt of jokes, and ridicule and scapegoating was cited as the cause of a number of withdrawals. Those who could ignore the ridicule found that it eventually stopped. One apprentice recalled, "The first month I felt like chucking the job in. I thought, no, I'm not going to let them get to me. When I started to stick up for myself, they started treating me like their sister." The refrain about the need for early resilience was repeated time and again by women who stayed the course. Sexual harassment was a major challenge. It was often ongoing and wide-ranging. Most women accepted with wolf whistling, but they did not like offensive name-calling, sexually explicit talk, suggestive approaches, chairs sniffed when they walked away, and threats of rape. One apprentice commented that the men needed to be trained that girls are only there to do the job, not as some sex object. In one survey, 1/3 of female apprentices had been subjected to unwanted physical contact. Professional women were also harassed. The first female electrical engineer employed by the BHP, Lee Ryan, felt that the company did not take positive steps to make conditions comfortable for women. Whenever she went to the toilet, a male worker would climb into the ceiling to watch her through a series of holes that he had made. Although he threatened her with violent rape, the matter was not properly investigated by management or referred to the police. Instead, Ryan was moved to another section where she could not pursue her specialisation in the design of microcomputers. She became disenchanted and resigned after only 18 months to become manager of a local hydraulics company. The perception that women had no place in heavy industry was expressed in many other ways as well. An English researcher had found that women in blue-collar men's jobs were sabotaged to the degree that they are perceived to pose a threat to men's belief in their unique ability to do the job. This was also the case in Newcastle, with one survey finding that 1/3 of female apprentices had their work interfered with or damaged. As a journalist commented, there was complex emotional and psychological resistance to females in non-traditional areas of employment. Changing deep-seated attitudes to gender roles did not happen easily. Now, the perceived need for separate toilets had been a frequently cited reason for excluding women from non-traditional occupations. Janet Murray jokes that her career was dictated by ladies' change houses and toilets. When she started as a trainee, she was sent to the coke ovens because by then there were women's facilities there for the mainly migrant women who shovelled up pieces of coke that had fallen off conveyor belts. During a later stint at the blast furnace, Murray shared a demountable toilet with one other woman. Eventually, BHP in those changing times built a women's bathroom block at the blast furnace. So when Murray was transferred to the sinter plant, she took the demountable with her. There were pragmatic changes necessary for women to work on the plant. Initially, it was difficult to source small-sized industrial gloves and suitable footwear. For example, Murray was provided with the crepe rubber-soled shoes issued to female staff. But when she was taken to the top of a battery of coke ovens with their huge loads of red-hot coke, her boss recognised the smell of burning rubber, and her shoes were quickly replaced with ones made of more durable material. Now, another reason employers had given for their reluctance to train women was their belief that they left work when they married or had children. While women were more likely to continue to work after marriage by the 1980s, there was still an expectation that heavy industry would not be compatible with motherhood. The first time a female apprentice in the Hunter became pregnant, her employer expected her to resign. To everyone's surprise, the young woman returned after the birth to finish her apprenticeship. I think the equal opportunity advocates must have breathed a huge sigh of relief. Now, the steel industry had no paid maternity leave, so pregnant women, what they did, they often worked until 6 weeks before their babies were due, then used their leave and took time off without pay. For economic and career reasons, many returned as soon as practical. That was women all over the Newcastle steel industry, not just at BHP. One steelmaker at BHP did resign after having her first child because shift work and a new baby did not mesh. After 3 years at home, however, she negotiated to return as part-time trainer. Now, this would not have been a trade union preference or a BHP tradition, but was a family-friendly solution. Some new mothers did leave permanently. One became the first female electrical engineering teacher in New South Wales Table. Now, it must be emphasised that women who stayed in the Newcastle steel industry formed good relationships with most of their workmates. As an apprentice electrical fitter commented, even the chauvinistic men on the plant started getting used to the women's presence. And Janet Murray found that BHP was full of nature's gentlemen, men who were courteous, supportive and non-predatory. But by 1983, external factors limited growth in women's recruitment into steelmaking. Because of a worldwide recession and an increase in global steel capacity, BHP's market share began declining. The company responded by downsizing steel operations. By June 1983, their Newcastle workforce had been reduced by 36% from the 1982 figure of 10,600. There was an immediate effect on trades. In 1983, male Stage 1 apprenticeship enrolments in Newcastle were halved, while female enrolments were down 1/3. Not proportionally as serious, but growth was necessary for a critical mass of women in the workplace. Although there was no longer a shortage of suitable males for apprenticeships, in a change from the reserve army practices of the past, at least heavy industry did continue to recruit young women and to promote them. It had been expected that women could not hold positions of authority in industry. In 1983, an executive of Port Kembla Steelworks complained that too many women were amongst the best applicants for metallurgy traineeships, which led to management positions, because, he said, everyone knows women can't supervise men. This assumption was proven wrong by the women steelworkers who climbed the ranks in Newcastle. Two women in particular stand out as breaking through the steel ceiling: Denise Goldsworthy and Janet Murray. When Goldsworthy had been appointed foreman in the steelmaking mill, the superintendent deliberately gave her the most difficult crew, assuming she would realise what he believed, that she would not be able to handle them. She was determined to prove him wrong. It was challenging. Some people didn't like me, she said. I had horrible nicknames and there was graffiti on the toilet walls. Yet over time, her crew accepted her very well. When Goldsworthy was promoted to superintendent of steelmaking mill, 140 workers, the criticism returned. She's too soft. She cries. She's lovey-dovey with the crew. She can't be the tough superintendent that's needed to run such a hard department. However, she proved her worth by breaking production records without mimicking tough masculinity. When two men were burnt beyond recognition in an accident in the mill, she said a lot of the crew came to talk to her about it and told her they could not have talked with a male superintendent in the same way. Goldsworthy's reputation as an achiever spread. In 1998, she was headhunted by Rio Tinto in Western Australia. Meanwhile, Janet Murray had returned to the blast furnace, a close approximation to hell on earth and supposed safe bastion of male supremacy. Here was the ultimate blokey culture where tough men did not wear their face shields. Murray was burnt a few times, but not seriously. Undeterred, she developed a fascination with the chemical processes of smelting iron ore with coke and limestone. As her knowledge grew, so did her level of responsibility. In 1995, she was promoted to operations superintendent in charge of 300 workers. Murray took supervision in her stride. She's a tall, stately woman whose mother was one of the early woman doctors in Newcastle. And she had no trouble with giving men orders. I don't recall them ignoring me, she said. If they thought they could get away with things, you let them know you didn't appreciate it. Now, Murray and Goldsworthy had been employed as part of a small intake of females intended to shield BHP from allegations of discrimination in the early 80s. Nevertheless, their promotions to superintendents of two of the most demanding departments on the plant were not tokenistic, but striking examples of BHP management recognising ability regardless of gender. In fact, Newcastle was probably the only steel company in the world with women in those positions at the time. Historian Frank Bongiorno has suggested that shoulder pads symbolise the changing status of women in Australia in the 1980s. I suggest in Newcastle it was hard hats. Now, although BHP and many of its subsidiaries ceased their Newcastle operations around 1999, women also entered the mining and aluminium industries. Belinda Greeley, who had trained as a chemical engineer at the steelworks and rose to operations leadership at Tomago Aluminium, argues that female leaders working in a sea of testosterone creates a new familiar, which brings about acceptance of more diversity in the workplace. And hopefully, accounts like mine, this one today, help demonstrate that women can forge a place in heavy industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jude, for that very fascinating look at local history here. We have plenty of time for questions. We might open it up to the floor. Yeah.
Hi, Jude. Sorry I arrived a bit late, but...
I knew you were on the train.
Thank you. Yeah, I was on the posting about Little Moscow. Yeah, I just want to know that your study sort of ends in the 90s with Janet Murray here. Has women's participation in these sorts of industries improved in terms of numbers, or did it plateau at a certain level? What's the percentage
most of the
now?
steel industries closed down.
Sure, but...
So as I said, there were some women continued on at what's called One Steel, I should remember, in Industrial Drive. There was a small steel industry there. As I said, women, there was a woman quite high up a number of women went into mining industries in the Hunter region, and there was a woman quite high up in the mining industry, I forget, Glencore, one of those companies, and in Tomago Aluminium. So they did continue, and there's BHP actually employs quite a few women in mining in Western Australia. And BHP now, if you look up BHP and women in Western Australia, they offer, you know, childcare places. They accept women in the workplace. It's just accepted. It's still there. They still have plenty of challenges.
But just generally in the industrial world in the country, women's positions have generally increased.
Yes, I believe, actually, I was talking to Erica Wanless the other day. She's a chemistry professor here. She said, I think 25% of chemical engineering students at Newcastle are female. So, yep. So, yeah, it changed. It didn't go right back to zero.
And of course, there's so much less physical labour. I mean, you're talking about in the early 80s, you have to be strong. And,
yes. It is, of course, it's more mechanised, as it became more mechanised. It was, yes, I do agree. It became a bit easier for women to be. And also, I think more machines were devised to help men because, I mean, a lot of men in the industry end up with bad backs and, enormous health problems.
And of course, it employs far less now because of that. I mean, the taxi driver was talking about his son-in-law operating the port at Newcastle with 3 people in the control room.
That was a terrific paper, and it's really fascinating work, and your ability to use different type of sources in building up this story. And you've raised so many different issues because you started with the role of the state in this story. So the role of trade unions, and so arbitration. How much of this can we pin on Higgins' original judgment?
Exactly.
But one thing it also highlights is the value of history and the concept of tradition, because we're told that this is a traditional role. But one thing that comes out of more recent feminist, well, I say recently, the last few decades of feminist work is the extent to which women, for example, were involved in the coal mining industry.
Yes.
And so what became tradition had to be created. So you mentioned the British legislation, so that starts in 1842. But there was a very nice piece of work done on coal mining in India. So another bit of the empire.
Yes.
And it was coal mining at, say, the start of the 20th century was heavily using Adivasi, indigenous women. So people who'd been pushed off their land were then brought into British-owned coal mines. And eventually they suddenly realised that there's all these women working down the mines, and that this is at odds with humanitarian values in Britain. So there's a big campaign, get the women out of the mines, which of course just leaves them without any income.
Yes.
And creates a whole set of other problems. But then comes the war, and they need to be able, Churchill wants enough coal to be able to fight and to fuel industry. So they bring the women back in. And so the thesis is about that natural experiment in which women are being pushed and pulled.
The reserve army.
They're very much a reserve army and very much without any understanding of the consequences of these individuals. But it just shows how malleable attitudes can be. And yet, even then, the battle that's taking place in our lifetimes to get access to better paid work. But yeah, I don't have a specific question other than whether you think the role of the state is by this point being supportive, because you've got, adverts being that we remember from being at school, those adverts start going up about girls can do anything. Did that help?
There is some, under the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, a federal one, it came out of that I think each year, I think it still happens, is that industry, businesses over a certain size, no, I've just forgotten, 100, 200, have to give a breakdown of, a gendered breakdown of where women are in the workforce and what positions and what levels. So I was actually able to look up blue steel to find, that there were still women sort of up in the hierarchy. It hadn't just been a 1980s thing that fell away. So that sort of kept everyone on their toes. So the government, and certainly the government, when I slightly sort of ridiculed the 1978 RAN attempt to get girls into non-traditional apprenticeships. Yes, they had posters in buses and trains, but some government departments did start employing girls in non-traditional trades. And that woman, Leslie Brown, who became the first TAFE teacher, she had actually applied to the BHP. She was a year behind me at high school, and she applied to the BHP to be an electrical trainee in 1968, and was told to try a more ladylike profession. But she got a traineeship with the Sydney Electricity Company. I can't remember their name now. And went through and did it with them. And she only then came she came to the BHP as a trained, electrical engineer, and worked there for a couple of years. But she had when she had a baby, she opted to become a teacher at TAFE. So the government, is playing little roles all along there. So, so they do have to provide that support. But what was good, I thought, was the fact that it didn't drop off. Once the BHP Newcastle started, cut their workforce 36%, that was a major thing. As said, male apprenticeships, first-year apprenticeships in the whole of Newcastle dropped by half. That's what a big impact that was. I thought it was good that, we didn't fall back to the reserve army thing. And I'm sure the government had a little role in there too. They kept employing girls as apprentices and trainees. But I just think, if you've got that support there in the first place, like these women showed the world, that what they could do once they got that toehold in. And I know they weren't enormous numbers, and I sort of narrowed down from the broader picture to, individual stories. But like my dad worked at the BHP for over 40 years. I mean, he was a metallurgist and he never got beyond assistant superintendent. I just really hope that everyone appreciates that to be superintendent of the blast furnace, that supposed bastion of Mount Supreme, and, the steelmaking mill were, major achievements. And I think this should be better known. And I was just talking to Nancy, there's been the council's doing this, updating their thematic history of Newcastle, asking for opinions. And I read through it, and it mentions a few women working in the steel industry in World War II. But because they only have made access to things that are available online, and the Labour History Journal, that this article, the talk based on the article is not just freely available at the moment. I'm going to send this article to them because I don't think they realised, that there's been this ongoing, women's role in the industry. I think it should be better known because I think it makes it easier for every other woman trying to get into non-traditional areas if these stories are better known.
Sasha? Absolutely fascinating paper. In the sort of second half of the 90s, I was working in legal publishing for my many sins, assembling case books of good books of case law. And there were lots of cases coming out at that time about sexual harassment, workplace sexual harassment. Mainly it felt in the mining industry, and really terrible stories and really terrible neglect by management. Did the BHP in Newcastle experience, I mean, you've spoken about the discrimination. Clearly the management was not active in at least the early 80s in doing anything. Were there similar cases in regards to the BHP in Newcastle, or did they manage to get their act together earlier, or?
I didn't hear that I didn't hear that the BHP Act sacked anyone.
Right, okay.
Or I've never heard. You know, I'm not saying that didn't happen because, you know, you're only trying to gather this information. As you say, it's been gathered from many different areas to put this together. But
Sure.
I don't think you would never have heard of any other, would you, Nancy, of any male worker being sacked or
Right.
being, you know, well, I don't know, maybe they weren't promoted or maybe there were complaints, but yeah, exactly. And you know, it's such a shame in a way that BHP closed in 1999 because I think would it be interesting if the steel industry had continued on, you know, because the numbers were increasing. And the fact that when the male enrolments dropped, that girls were still apprenticed. Once again, that they didn't, we didn't fall back to the reserve. So it would have been interesting to go for another 20 or 30 years. So.
Hey, Jude, I'm Janae. That's so great. I love this research a lot. And I think that, women's facilities are such a clear indication of the presumed kind of gender makeup of a workforce. And no women's facilities was the excuse given for not allowing women reporters onto the battlefield. That's the greatest kind of reason.
Yes.
And I've recently been researching women in manufacturing of domestic electrical equipment, so women making valves and that sort of thing. And those factories in Sydney, when they were built, they had women's bathrooms and women's lunchrooms and women's change rooms, you know, were all included and trumpeted in the press that they had these facilities because they assumed that that workforce was going to be female or largely kind of female, so I'm really interested in that.
Tricky little work, you need little fingers for.
Well,
sorry.
not always.
Not always.
But so what I was wondering about was are there gendered spaces within BHP that aren't work related? So were women segregated like in the canteen? Or what about socialising and that sort of thing? I just wondered about.
Well, I worked in the computer centre, so that's for nearly 4 years. So that was not out on the plant, and we certainly socialised with the men. Some of them had been to school with my brother. I used to play cards, but and there were the programmers, right, and then there were the operators, because in those days, big mainframe computers, you know, with big tapes. So all the operators that looked after, you know, those machines were male. And then when we first started, we used to write our programs out on cards. I did COBOL programming, and they went to the punch girls. Yeah, very well, punch girls, who were all in a room together and were strictly controlled by their boss, much more strictly controlled than anyone else in the whole of the computer centre. You know, permission to go to the toilet, you know, very, very closely controlled. They were treated quite differently, and I remember noticing that because I was already strong feminist at the time, and And just for interest, one of the things that happened when I was at the computer centre, the BHP Staff Recreation Club was to belong to it, you had to be male staff. So this is another form of discrimination. And then in about 1980 or 81, they thought, oh, maybe we should let, a few more women coming in as staff. There was a lot of women staff in the computer centre. Oh, maybe we should let women become staff. So they decided to have a vote. At the time, women could go in there if they were escorted by a man, and then they had to leave by a certain time. Whereas the male staff could take, at BHP, there were two levels of workers. There's staff, who wore green when they went out on the plant, and there were the workers who wore blue.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah.
Right, so this was the staff recreation club. This is for the upper echelon. And they could take a male worker in and he could stay till close. But the female staff had to be out by a certain time. Anyway, so they had a vote. They were discussing, what will they vote? Oh, their wives will get jealous.
Was that a division between salaried and weekly paid? Or?
Yeah, everyone at BHP it was either fortnightly pay, or if you got to a certain level, you were on monthly pay.
But the green does also reflect that.
Well, yeah, everyone at BHP had fortnightly pay except the very top level. They were higher than just the green level. I was green level, but I was fortnightly pay.
Okay, got it. Thank
So
you.
now it's to do with whether you were a metallurgist or, whether you had professional training. Computer programmers were staff. So, yeah. And anyway, their wives would get jealous. There would be swearing. That's okay.
Yeah.
Women aren't allowed to hear swear words. They wouldn't be able to be the same. But anyway, they voted that women could join. So in about 81 or so, BHP Recreation Club became allowed women staff to be full members. So there were things happening right, left and centre. And I mean, canteens were, probably predominantly female workers.
After you haven't had a chance to ask questions.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I really loved that. I'm interested in what the place of the migrant women was in all of this, maybe the children of migrants at this point, or non-white women generally. Where were they positioned? Were they there? Well, they would have been there.
Well, they started being there. So, as I said, in 1973, so, some women were employed out on the plant, 200. But by 1980, there was only 140 left. But when Janet Murray started, so she started 1980, and her first portfolio was the coke ovens, and they did have women's toilets there and they were all migrant women who were doing this heavy labouring, which probably the average white woman in Newcastle wouldn't even think of applying for. But some of those women maybe had worked in that kind of work. It wasn't so, you don't do this back in Yugoslavia or wherever. And they were employed in this low level, so not, shoveling coke. But Janet told me that their promotional structures, what's that term? There's a term for, how high you could rise, was very limited, because in the area kind of job they were doing, labouring or whatever, there were certain things you could do to get promoted. And some of those involved tasks that they weren't allowed to do, or they couldn't do, or they weren't, so they could never really get promoted. And that just tended to be the migrant women who were prepared to take those kind of jobs in Newcastle. One, I haven't mentioned the Jobs for Women campaign. I thought someone might raise that. That was particularly big in Wollongong, where a lot of, which Wollongong had 28% at the time it was called non-English speaking background, whereas Newcastle only had 11%. When they say one reason there were less migrants in Newcastle than Wollongong was because it was so hard for women to get jobs, and a lot of the migrant women want to work because they had to re-establish their lives, So they often went elsewhere because it's so hard for women to get work in Newcastle. Anyway, sorry, I'm starting to drift all over the place.
Well, we are at time, so we might thank Jude one more time for this And an excellent end to our semester 2 seminar series. So I want to thank everybody who's regularly tuned in and would watch on YouTube, and all the presenters, of course, over the past few weeks for making this such a successful series. And I invite everybody to join us again in January of next year, where we'll do much more of the same, though following our new academic calendar. If you're listening to this on YouTube or otherwise not on the mailing list, please reach out to me at Ryan Strickler at Newcastle,
Calendar.
and I can add you to the list.
And can we thank Ryan for having run this time?
Thank you very much.